I inherited the ranch on a Tuesday, the kind of dusty, sun-bleached morning where the horizon looks painted on and the wind carries the smell of dry grass and old iron. And with it came 4,200 acres of land, 3 barns that leaned like tired men, a creek that cut through the valley like a scar, and a wooden bridge so old that its timbers still bore axe marks from a century ago, a bridge my great-grandfather built with his own hands so cattle could cross during flood season. And that bridge, as it turned out, was the problem, because within a week of the probate papers being signed, a white SUV with an HOA logo on the door rolled up the ranch road like it owned the place, stopping just short of the bridge as if the tires themselves were offended by dirt. And out stepped a woman in a pressed polo shirt and sunglasses large enough to hide whatever empathy she might have once had, who introduced herself as the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association and informed me, with the practiced smile of someone used to being obeyed, that my bridge violated their community's safety guidelines. I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, because the nearest Willow Creek Estates lawn began a full mile from my fence line, and their manicured little paradise had been carved out of what used to be the lower grazing fields before my grandfather sold it off in the 1980s, but she wasn't joking. And when I pointed out that the bridge had been there longer than her subdivision, longer than her HOA, probably longer than her parents' marriage, she tapped a clipboard and said the words that would come to haunt me for months. "It's a liability," and then she explained slowly and loudly as if I were a child that their residents sometimes use the bridge as a scenic shortcut during jogs and bike rides, and that if anyone were injured, the HOA could be exposed to legal risk, so they had voted to have it removed. And when I told her they had no jurisdiction on my land, she smiled again and said they'd already spoken to the county about easement concerns, which was news to me, because no such easement existed, at least not one recorded. But she waved away my objections with a final warning that demolition would proceed the following Monday. And then she got back into her SUV and drove away, leaving dust hanging in the air like an insult. I spent the next few days pulling records, talking to a local attorney, and walking the bridge at sunset, running my hand along the cracked beams and remembering fishing there as a kid, watching my dad lean against the railing while the creek roared below during spring melt. And every instinct told me they were bluffing, that no one would dare tear down a private bridge without due process. But Monday morning arrived with the sound of diesel engines. And before I could even finish my coffee, 2 excavators and a flatbed truck rolled onto my land, escorted by a county vehicle. And despite my shouting and my paperwork and my phone calls, the machines went to work, metal jaws crunching through wood that had survived floods, fires, and generations of use until the bridge collapsed into the creek with a sound like a gunshot, water splashing high enough to soak the operators. And when it was over, all that remained were broken pilings and the slow, indifferent flow of water carrying pieces of my history downstream. And the HOA president stood there again, hands on hips, nodding as if she'd just supervised a successful bake sale, and told me I could submit a formal complaint to the board if I had concerns, then turned and left without another word. That night, I sat on the porch, long after dark, listening to the creek and the coyotes in the deep, steady silence of land that had seen worse than bureaucrats, and something hardened in me, not rage exactly, but resolve, because the bridge hadn't just been wood and nails, it had been access, and without it, I couldn't move cattle across during high water, couldn't reach the south pasture without a 6-mile detour. And when I went back through the county files again, angrier and more thorough this time, I found the truth buried in old survey maps and handwritten notes, the kind no one reads anymore, showing that when Willow Creek Estates was approved, the developers had rerouted drainage patterns, channeling storm runoff toward my land, relying on the creek and the bridge area to handle overflow, and more importantly, that their entire western boundary sat lower than the natural grade. Protected for decades, by the way, water spread across my fields before reaching them, fields that now, without the bridge constriction, could legally be regraded because it was my land, and the water was mine to manage as long as I didn't redirect it artificially toward them. And that's when the idea formed, slow and deliberate, like the turning of gears, not out of spite, I told myself, but necessity, because if they were going to remove my bridge under the banner of safety, then I would improve safety in my own way, using the same laws they'd twisted against me. And as I stood there the next morning watching sunlight glint off the creek, I traced a line in the dirt with my boot. A wide arc that followed the natural contour of the land between my ranch and their pristine lawns, imagining not a fence, not a wall, but a moat, deep and broad, designed to manage floodwater, prevent erosion, and restore the natural flow that had existed long before their cul-de-sacs and decorative ponds. And for the first time since the bridge fell, I smiled, because they thought they'd taken something from me and walked away clean. But land remembers, water remembers, and I was about to remind them that ranchers don't fight with clipboards in meetings. They fight with patience, paperwork, and a shovel big enough to make a point. The next morning, before the HOA could even file their obligatory concerned neighbor email or schedule their next community board meeting, I drove out to the area where the bridge had stood and began marking the perimeter for the moat, with bright orange survey flags zigzagging across the terrain with careful attention to slope, soil type, and water flow. Because I didn't want this to be some shallow trench that could be crossed with a step, I wanted a proper barrier, a statement of engineering as well as intent. And as I worked, the reality of what I was about to do started to sink in. The machinery I would need, the permits I would have to secure, and the sheer labor that a 1,000-year-old oak and a few million gallons of water would demand. But there was also exhilaration in it, a raw satisfaction that comes only when you decide to take the fight into your own hands. And over the course of the week, I made calls to local contractors under the guise of erosion control and wetland restoration, explaining to every skeptical voice on the other end that this was a legal, environmentally sound project necessary to prevent flood damage downstream, which technically it was. Though I wasn't exactly lying when I said that, and slowly. As the survey flags multiplied across the rolling land, I began to visualize the moat not just as a ditch, but as a full defensive system. Steep banks lined with native stone to prevent collapse, a small diversion channel upstream to control flow during heavy rains, a natural sediment trap to reduce siltation into my lower pastures, and perhaps most importantly, a way to make sure the HOA residents, their golf carts, jogging paths, and little decorative bridges were no longer casually intruding onto my property without thinking twice. The design was meticulous, down to the last angle, because the last thing I wanted was for the water to spill into areas I didn't intend, or for the construction to be shut down by inspectors who might find some loophole to claim I was overbuilding. And by the end of the week, I had a full plan drawn up, complete with elevation charts, soil compaction specs, and flow calculations. Looking for all the world like a legitimate environmental mitigation project, while in reality serving as both a flood control mechanism and a subtle territorial reminder that my ranch was not a playground for HOA egos. I ordered the excavation equipment carefully, renting a backhoe, a small bulldozer, and a dump truck under a business account that made it look like a municipal project. And when the trucks arrived, I felt a thrill seeing them rumble across my fields, hydraulic arms reaching out like giant metal fingers ready to reshape the land. And I spent that first day digging a test trench along the creek to ensure the water would behave as predicted, marveling at how fast it cut through the soil and how natural it looked when the banks began to form, almost like the earth itself had been waiting for this project. And neighbors noticed, though none of them dared approach, because there was something about seeing a backhoe carve into the land that commands respect, even fear. And as the hours passed, I couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. The HOA had destroyed a simple wooden bridge in the name of safety and liability, yet here I was creating an engineered waterway far more substantial than anything they could imagine, on my own land, fully legal, fully justified, and fully inevitable. And I chuckled when imagining the reaction when the first HOA resident drove down their perfectly paved street, only to find that what they had considered a harmless scenic shortcut now ended at a steep, muddy trench filled with water. Because no matter how fast they ran, or how much they complained, the only way across would be the long road around, the road I had carefully preserved and controlled. Over the next few weeks, the work became all-consuming. I would rise before dawn, grab a thermos of coffee, and walk the property with my engineer's eyes, noting every contour, every depression, every tree that could either aid or hinder water flow. And then I would climb into the bulldozer and move earth with a precision that made me almost meditative. The repetitive motion of digging and dumping, forming a rhythm that became almost hypnotic, while the creek sang in the background, oblivious to human disputes, and I would sometimes pause just to watch the water swirl where a trench had been. Dug the day before, imagining how it would look during a storm, imagining how the HOA would squirm when they finally realized they're safe. Development was now bordered by an unbreachable natural barrier. And in the evenings, exhausted but satisfied, I would sit on the porch with my dog, watching the sun dip behind the hills and think about the bridge my grandfather had built, the bridge they had destroyed, and how the land had taught me patience, cunning, and the subtle art of proving a point without ever having to resort to yelling. Because a moat doesn't argue, a moat simply exists, and in its existence it enforces its own message. I made sure the construction was environmentally sound, planting willow saplings along the banks to stabilize the soil, adding gravel and rocks to prevent erosion, and even creating small natural pools that encouraged wildlife to return, so that if anyone from the HOA dared visit, they would see not just a ditch, but a living system, vibrant, functional, and entirely beyond their control. A masterpiece disguised as a civil engineering project, and I documented everything meticulously, taking photos, notes, and even aerial drone footage under the pretext of progress reports for wetland authorities, so that if anyone challenged me legally, I would have a full portfolio demonstrating intent, legality, and environmental stewardship. While in reality, the documentation also served to show how deliberately I had reshaped the boundary between my land and their development, how carefully I had manipulated flow and grade, and how every inch of the moat had been designed to emphasize the point that while they could vote on community aesthetics, they could not vote on my property or dictate its use. By the fourth week, the moat was beginning to take shape in earnest. It was wider than a typical drainage ditch, deep enough that a person could not easily step across, with meandering curves that made it look natural rather than manufactured. Water beginning to settle in the deeper areas, reflecting the sky like glass, and the edges reinforced with stones to prevent washouts. I even installed a small wooden footbridge at one corner, a nod to tradition for my own use and for anyone officially permitted. But the rest of the boundary was now a continuous, wet barrier, more than a statement, a transformation of the land itself. I could already imagine the HOA residents walking their little dogs along their neat sidewalks and peering over fences in horror at the view. Because the bridge had been a convenience, a minor shortcut, whereas the moat was a declaration. Visible, unignorable, and utterly permanent unless I chose otherwise. And then, as if on cue, the rains came. The skies opened up one evening. It's a warm January thunderstorm, dumping more water than I had anticipated in weeks, and the moat filled almost instantly, water rising to the banks, flowing through the diversion channels I had installed, creating small ripples and mini currents exactly as I had calculated. And the creek swelled just enough to send a few ripples across the lower pasture without damaging anything, proving that my calculations, my patience, and my attention to detail were correct. And as I watched from the porch, the reflection of the clouds and the hills shimmering in the moat, I felt a surge of satisfaction that went deeper than revenge or pride. It was the satisfaction of someone who had taken a wrong done to them, measured it, thought it through, and responded not with blind anger, but with precision, legality, and inevitability, creating a natural barrier that served as both engineering, solution, and moral statement. And I knew, as I poured a second cup of coffee, that the first time an HOA member tried to cross that line, they would realize, far too late, that I had mastered both the art of land and the art of patience, because the moat, like my ancestors' bridge, would endure. And unlike the bridge, it was designed so that no one could simply tear it down without my consent, no matter how many board meetings they held, no matter how many letters they wrote, no matter how many liability concerns they conjured. Because this time, I was the one controlling the water. And as the rain poured down and filled the new channels, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, knowing that every drop was a reminder, flowing, visible, undeniable reminder that my land was mine. My decisions were final, and my bridge gone. though had been replaced with something far more eloquent, far more permanent, and far more satisfying than any timber and nail could ever have been. By the time word began to spread about my new project, the HOA was in full panic mode, though they tried to disguise it as concerned citizen inquiries and requests for compliance inspections, the emails, letters, and phone calls, arriving at all hours, each more absurd than the last, claiming everything from unauthorized water diversion to potential mosquito breeding grounds. But I had anticipated their tactics, and each letter was meticulously cataloged, logged, and filed with photographic evidence, construction permits, and environmental assessments that not only proved my actions were entirely legal, but also illustrated just how much thought, planning, and engineering had gone into the moat, turning every petty complaint into a showcase of my meticulous attention to detail. And I responded politely, formally, but firmly, referencing codes, statutes, and municipal guidelines, never once using language that could be construed as threatening because I wanted to win the moral high ground as well as the practical one, knowing that eventually the HOA would realize that every attempt to intervene was not just futile, but also legally precarious for them. Meanwhile, the moat itself continued to grow in depth and breadth with each day of labor, rain, and minor excavations, the banks now reaching heights that made casual crossing impossible without equipment, and the water fed by both the creek and carefully designed runoff channels glistened in the sunlight like a liquid wall, a tangible and permanent reminder that my land was no longer just a plot on a map, but a fully defended, self-contained system under my exclusive control. And there was a certain poetry in that, because while the HOA prided itself on its meticulously mowed lawns, clean sidewalks, and rules governing the placement of trash cans, I had created a living, flowing, unstoppable barrier that no board vote, no bylaw, and no letterhead could undo. Neighbors began noticing the change as well, the sound of machinery at dawn, the slow formation of a trench that now held water and curved in natural arcs across the terrain. And while most stayed behind fences and trees, some curious onlookers, hikers, and even wildlife enthusiasts came closer, marveling at how the earth itself seemed to bend to my will. And though they offered casual compliments, I could see in their eyes the unspoken acknowledgement. This was not a petty feud. This was the manifestation of someone who understood land in a way most city dwellers never would. And the subtle message to the HOI that I was not someone to be trifled with radiated as clearly as the sunlight reflecting off the new waterway. The first confrontation occurred 3 weeks after the moat had reached near completion. A group of HOA board members, led by the same woman who had orchestrated the destruction of my bridge, arrived in their SUVs, armed with clipboards, cameras, and the kind of authoritative body language that usually convinces people to comply without question. But as they approached the boundary line, the first thing they encountered was the trench itself, water dark and deep, mud-slick banks that sloped sharply, and curves that prevented a straight path, and suddenly the air of superiority faltered, replaced by hesitation, murmurs, and an unmistakable recognition that their carefully honed tactics would be ineffective here, on land that was entirely mine and now defended by hydraulics, gravity, and the natural behavior of water. They circled the perimeter, cameras snapping, questions muttered, and I stood at the edge, hat pulled low against the sun, coffee in hand, watching as they assessed the impossibility of crossing without either my permission or significant equipment. And when the leader of the group finally called out, demanding that I restore access immediately, I calmly explained, citing water management regulations, environmental codes, and flood control measures, that the project was fully compliant, legally approved, and designed to manage water flow safely, that the trench was part of a long-term plan to protect both my land and surrounding areas, and that any interference could result in civil and criminal liability on their part. The silence that followed was thick and almost audible, broken only by the soft ripple of water in the moat and the occasional bird calling from the nearby trees. And in that moment, I understood that I had shifted the balance of power completely, because the HOA's authority had been nothing but paper and meetings, whereas I now commanded reality itself, the tangible, immovable, undeniable reality of flowing water in steep banks, and they had no choice but to acknowledge it. In the days that followed, they attempted what they could from a distance, sending more letters, posting notices on community boards, hiring surveyors to check property lines, even threatening legal action with large law firms whose names I recognized. From real estate cases, but each time I responded with precise, documented evidence showing that their claims were baseless, that my project was compliant with county ordinances, and that any attempt to forcibly enter or alter my property would be not only unlawful, but dangerous, because the moat was deeper and steeper than they had imagined, with hidden undercuts and reinforced banks designed to resist erosion and accidental entry, and by the time the first storm of spring arrived, the water had stabilized into a permanent channel, clear, steady, and full of life. Ducks and herons taking up residence along the banks, small fish moving freely, and the moat had become more than a barrier. It had become a part of the ecosystem, a flowing, living testament to careful planning, patience, and a refusal to accept injustice quietly. The psychological impact on the HOA was immediate. Board meetings now included discussions about the unexpected waterway and possible insurance exposure, and casual references in the community newsletter transformed from benign updates into thinly veiled complaints, while the residents themselves, who had once crossed the bridge casually during morning jogs or dog walks, now faced a full-mile detour along public roads, encountering gates, fences, and warning signs I had installed, politely but firmly explaining that the area was private and protected, and while none of this violated any laws, it sent a clear message that the privileges they had assumed were neither permanent nor guaranteed. And as I watched a small group of joggers retreat from the edge of the water one morning, muttering under their breath, I felt an unexpected sense of justice, tempered not by malice, but by the natural consequence of choices. Because the land had protected itself through me, and the message was unavoidable. Treat this ranch as yours, and risk the consequences. Respect it, and there was room for coexistence. In the quiet moments between construction, legal correspondence, and strategic planning, I began documenting the story more formally, taking drone footage, photographing wildlife interactions, charting water flow, and even recording time-lapse sequences of the moat filling and receding with weather events, not only to preserve a record of the project, but also to create a kind of manifesto, a visual and legal argument for the power of property rights, environmental stewardship, and strategic patience. And these records would later serve to silence critics, demonstrate compliance, and provide a kind of storytelling proof that even a bureaucratic HOA could not ignore, because once the footage went public in local news and social media, the narrative shifted, with neighbors and outsiders marveling at the scale, intelligence, and creativity of the project, many offering praise for how a potentially disastrous water situation had been handled with ingenuity, and the HOA could no longer claim moral high ground because the reality on the landfall, flowing and undeniable, was self-evident.
Oh.
And by combining the physical moat with meticulous legal and environmental documentation, I had created a system that was as resistant to bureaucratic challenge as it was to human trespass, a dual-layered defense of both law and geography. And each letter, phone call, and meeting from the HOA thereafter felt increasingly hollow, almost performative, as the moat itself, teeming with life and reflecting the sky, conveyed a far louder and more permanent message than any words could. Then came the defining moment, the one that would be recounted in local stories for months. During a neighborhood association gathering, the HOA president personally attempted to approach the edge of the property with a small entourage, armed with clipboards and a faux air of authority, only to stop abruptly when her foot slipped on the muddy bank and she realized she was too close to the water. The cameras in her hands wavered, the polite script of pre-prepared complaints faltered, and she finally stepped back, exclaiming something about needing permission to enter private land. All while the gathered residents, curious but hesitant, whispered among themselves, staring at the moat as if it were a living dragon, and I, from a discreet distance, watched with satisfaction as the symbolic and physical barriers merged into one, the trench and water asserting control in a way no paper mandate ever could. And I knew at that moment that the fight had been won not with rage, not with confrontation, but with foresight, patience, and the deliberate shaping of natural forces to achieve a goal far beyond what a mere argument or lawsuit could accomplish. From then on, interactions with the HOA were reduced to perfunctory emails. Their attempts to negotiate or interfere visibly tempered by the understanding that my land was now defended not by fences or threats but by careful engineering, environmental, law, and the immutable flow of water itself. And as the seasons changed, the moat. Spring turned into summer, and the moat had settled into a rhythm of its own, the water reflecting the sun in a way that made it impossible to ignore, shimmering across the landscape like a ribbon of silver that both celebrated and protected the ranch. And in that time, the HOA's attempts to regain influence dwindled into the background, reduced to quiet mutterings in community meetings, half-hearted emails, increasingly desperate phone calls that went unanswered. Because I had learned long ago that responding to petty threats with measured silence and documentation was far more effective than anger or confrontation, and so I let the moat speak for me. Its banks reinforced with stone, willow trees planted strategically to control erosion, and native grasses creating natural buffers that made trespassing not just difficult but physically impossible without proper permission or preparation. And as I walked the perimeter one warm afternoon, watching the sun catch on the water and birds darting in and out of the rippling reflection, I felt a deep satisfaction, the kind that only comes from executing a plan perfectly, knowing that the bridge the HOA had destroyed had been replaced not by wood and nails but by something far stronger, a combination of law, labor, and land itself. And I allowed myself a quiet chuckle imagining the HOA president's face the first time she tried to navigate the trench, realizing too late that the power they once thought they had was meaningless in the face of carefully applied knowledge, patience, and foresight. Word began to spread beyond the immediate neighborhood, first in hushed conversations, then in local newsletters, finally in regional social media groups, about the rancher who had turned a destroyed bridge into a moat. And suddenly I was not just defending property, I was making a statement, a visible, undeniable reminder that arrogance and bureaucracy have limits, that those who think they can impose their will on others without consequence often find themselves outmatched by the combination of preparation, legality, and resolve, and I relished it, not for malice, but for the satisfaction of seeing fairness restored in the most literal, concrete way possible. And as the community adjusted to the presence of the moat, life on the ranch began to settle into a new, productive routine. Cattle moved safely through other passages I had reinforced. The creek maintained its natural flow, and even during heavy rainfall, there were no floods, no disputes, just the quiet satisfaction of land behaving exactly as it should, and under my stewardship, the ecosystem flourished, with small fish and frogs inhabiting pools along the moat's curves, birds nesting along the banks, and even deer and other wildlife beginning to treat the area as a safe corridor, a living, breathing proof that careful planning, respect for natural forces, and a commitment to legal and environmental principles could create harmony even in the midst of human conflict. Meanwhile, the HOA's influence waned. Their threats and meetings rendered symbolic gestures rather than actionable commands, because the moat's existence was irrefutable, undeniable, and permanent. The board attempted to paint it as a nuisance or a minor obstruction in local newsletters. But photos, drone footage, and documented compliance made these claims look absurd to any impartial observer. And over time, their attempts at intimidation dwindled to silence, a tacit acknowledgement that my actions were not only justified but exemplary, a demonstration of what can happen when someone defends their rights with intelligence, patience, and a strategic mind. And as I walked along the banks of the moat, watching the sunlight glint across the water and the wildlife move undisturbed, I realized that the true victory was not the inconvenience caused to the HOA, but the restoration of control, the reassertion of property rights, and the creation of a sustainable, functional, and beautiful solution that no bureaucrat could undo. A triumph of foresight over arrogance, planning over chaos, and natural law over artificial authority. There were moments when I reflected on the bridge my grandfather had built. The timber and nails that had connected pastures, people, and generations, and while its destruction had been painful, it had taught me something vital about strategy, patience, and the enduring strength of property when combined with knowledge and determination. And the moat, in all its engineered elegance, became a symbol not just of defense, but of intelligence applied thoughtfully. A reminder that even when others act recklessly or unjustly, careful planning, legal knowledge, respect for the land can turn misfortune into opportunity, and in those moments, the satisfaction was not petty. It was profound, rooted in the understanding that one can achieve justice without malice, dominance without cruelty, and permanence without destruction. And as the seasons continued to change, the moat remained steadfast, reflecting autumn leaves, winter snow, and spring blooms. An unyielding barrier and a living testament to the power of foresight, resilience, and quiet determination. Over time, I even invited local schools, environmental clubs, nature enthusiasts to observe the area, framing the moat as both a water management project and a living classroom, explaining how natural flow, soil stabilization, erosion prevention, and habitat creation could coexist, and in doing so, I reframed what had once been a confrontation into a legacy of education, sustainability, and respect for land, turning a dispute into an opportunity to demonstrate stewardship and responsibility, all while reinforcing the practical lesson to the HOA that land, once properly understood and managed, cannot be bullied or trivialized, and that true authority comes from knowledge, preparation, and the application of skill, not titles or self-imposed boards. By the end of that first full year, the moat had matured into a permanent, thriving feature of the ranch, with wildlife thriving along its banks. Sediment controlled naturally, the water level maintained at a sustainable depth that prevented flooding while ensuring ecological balance. And the HOA, having exhausted every legal avenue and witnessing the undeniable success of the project, gradually stopped their interventions, their letters and emails becoming sporadic, their meetings focusing on other matters, and the residents themselves slowly adjusted to the new reality, taking the long route around the ranch, learning to respect property boundaries, and coming to appreciate, perhaps grudgingly, the ingenuity and resilience that had transformed what they had intended as a punitive act into a landmark achievement in land management, engineering, and personal resolve. And in this way, the story of the bridge, the destruction, and the moat became more than a tale of revenge, became a narrative about foresight, resilience, the enduring strength of law when paired with strategy, and the ability of one person, with patience and knowledge, to shape outcomes on a scale that demanded respect. In the end, I would sit on the porch at sunset, watching the water glisten, listening to the sounds of the land I had defended, feeling the cool evening breeze, and the satisfaction of a job done not only well, but decisively. And I would remember the first day the HOA arrived, the destruction of the bridge, and the doubt that had crept in, only to be replaced by determination, planning, and action. And I knew that the moat was more than a barrier, it was a testament, an education, a legacy, and a reminder that those who underestimate the power of land, patience, and intellect often find themselves humbled, not by force, but by inevitability. And that in defending one's property with intelligence, care, and resolve, one can turn injustice into an enduring achievement, creating something beautiful, functional, and permanent. Something that will outlast the petty disputes, the board meetings, the letters, and the complaints, leaving behind a story of cleverness, patience, and the enduring, unstoppable power of a person who knows both the land and the law, and who refuses to allow arrogance to go unchecked. And as I pour the last cup of coffee for the evening, watching sunlight glint across the moat, I smile quietly, knowing the land remembers, the water remembers, and the message is clear. This ranch, this moat, and this victory belong to me, and anyone who thought otherwise now has no choice but to acknowledge it.